So why is worship important?
Well, first of all, get the notion out of your head that worship is for God. Whatever God there is doesn't need it. No, worship is for people. And speaking from a purely psychological, scientific point of view, it is not only important, it is vital. Because what it does is make people reach beyond what is obvious, beyond the here and now, and it gives them a sense of what some people call transcendence, which means that it makes them able to reach beyond known and definable horizons. And without that, there is no human progress. So, worship is important, not merely for pietistic religious reasons. Behind that pietistic religious stuff is something basically and importantly human, necessary for the development of humanity.
In the spectrum of worship.
What do you mean by spectrum?
Well, from someone,
Oh,
from simply going to a church, going to a church service on a Sunday morning, for example, to what you envision, what you see as
good worship,
exemplary
effective worship,
experience of worship. You know, kind of.
What the hell it is I'm working at? Yes.
What distinguishes that from what you're
Well, what
suggesting?
normally goes on is that people take a, quote, given tradition, open the book, and read it out well or badly every Sunday morning. And no matter how well it may be read in a limited sense, unless it is dealt with, quote, dramatically, unquote, that is, given what Aristotle speaks of as a beginning, a middle, and an end, it will not have movement. It will be static. And therefore, it won't do what we expect worship to do, that is, inspire and uplift people. It won't heal, it won't stimulate growth, spiritual growth. It won't develop that sense of transcendence unless it is made, in Aristotle's sense of the word, dramatic. It must have motion. And it must have a motion from beginning to middle to end. That is, it must be in a direction. It must start from a certain premise, work up through the preambles to, quote, face whatever the problem, if you want to speak of it in that terms, I don't mean specifically a problem, is, and then resolve it. And when we're dealing with worship that is ritualistic, that is, has a lot of visual to it instead of just words, you've got to also take into consideration what Aristotle says about things having size or magnitude. The Sistine Chapel, reduced to postage stamp, is not impressive. You understand what I mean? So what is done from the altar surroundings has to be big enough to be seen, big enough to be impressive. Somebody asked, well, why do you wear that large ring? So they will watch my hand instead of ignoring it. It helps to focus. And it gives my hand some magnitude, some size, psychologically speaking. That's one of the qualities it must have. Secondly, the movement must not be, that is, physical movement on the altar. It's not on the altar, it's in the space surrounding the altar. It has to be have a certain, I want to say dignity to it, but then I'm not sure that that's the right word. It must have a certain quality to it. You can't walk in as if you got 2 buckets of milk in your hand and you're trying to get into the kitchen door from the barn. You have to walk with a certain smoothness. It can't be too fast, nor too slow. It must move.
Do people, the participants of the worship, in our society in general, do they care about that?
They don't have to care consciously. They care because they are made the way they are made. For example, a particular movement and a particular visible thing. Now that the ministers or the priests do not preside at the Eucharist with their backs to the congregation and the altar's out front facing the congregation, we have a carryover of doing some of the things we did when it was up with their back, and they would genuflect. And the genuflection, again, isn't for God. It's to inspire in the congregation a sense of reverence, okay? If you do that, and you're behind an altar that's at least waist high, and sometimes higher than that, and you genuflect, it's not a good idea. It will not inspire reverence. What it does is, now you see me, now you don't. And people don't laugh at that particular point. But if I'm giving a lecture on, worship and how it's carried out, and I bring that point up, they fall out. What they have been subconsciously noticing and what has been incongruous to them becomes consciously incongruous, and they never afterwards can they look at this disappearing act without saying, what is that fool doing? You should know better. Sure, in the most basic sense of the word is not just what people want. What people say they want is not necessarily what they want. A few years ago, at your mother-in-law's, Sally Fellerhoff, the hostess, had before, there was on that evening at the Athenaeum, a ceremony of carols. And she had some of her friends over for dinner before, and they attended the carol service, and they came back to her house for drinks and conversation afterwards. The whole purpose of the evening was to bring people with common interest to this carol service and surrounded with food and drink and so forth. Well, the food and drink was very fine, but the carol service was, I only came afterwards, you were there. I only came, they did not mention the carol service in all the conversation afterwards, except to say, church shouldn't be too long. You know, 45 minutes at most, maybe a half hour. I mean, it's still better if it's a half hour. 45 minutes at most, still better if it's a half hour. A lot better if it's less. Which means they're not getting anything out of it. If they were getting anything out of it, they wouldn't be limiting it. When you're having a good meal, you don't say, let's cut this time short on this meal. We got lots of nothing to do. Let's go and sit in here and do nothing. You know, if it's absorbing and it's, but unfortunately, this carol service was done in what some people think of as the Anglo-Saxon style, not realizing what barbarians Anglo-Saxons are. They think the Anglo-Saxon style is to be totally controlled, and they don't really mean control, they mean totally suppression of any human emotion. So you get, it's just almost a static sound throughout the evening. No fortissimos, no pianos, just very moderate movement of sound throughout the evening. And one song blends into the other, and they all sound alike, and people just want to get out. Get it over with and get out. And the choir was a nice choir. But I think that the director, who is as Italian as you are, didn't have any Italian instincts. He had taken on what he thought were English, Anglo-Saxon instincts. And his directions were all movements of his fingers. And the choir was directed to be extremely moderate in their expression. And it was nice for one song like that, for a whole evening, just itching to get out at the end. And that's all those people at your mother-in-law's house could say that evening. Church services shouldn't be too long. This wasn't even a service, it was a concert.
Are you saying that the only difference between what exists and what you want is a layer of theatricality?
Well, I'll accept that. But you got to understand what theatricality means.
Okay,
it means
what I'm
putting
suggesting
life,
sounds rather pejorative.
But that's the problem. Theatricality has pejorative overtones laid onto it by a puritanical society, which does not allow for expressiveness, except in the dark, you know, for sex. You can be expressive if you want, as long as you're under the covers and in the dark. But don't, for God's sake, don't turn the lights on. Can we turn some of these lights out? That's the way it goes. Somehow we were embarrassed by human expressiveness. And therefore I say we, meaning the culture, doesn't handle it well. Now, where that comes from is interesting. I just I used to think of it in terms of, what most people think of when they think of terms of Puritanism. But that Puritanism is much more fundamental and much more important than we would normally give it credit for. That narrow band of criticism, not criticism, but narrow band of Puritanism that we are, it's like seeing only one light, one part of the light out of, light which has a whole spectrum, to use your word, of colors in it. From infrared to ultraviolet. The only thing we normally see about Puritanism is its suppression of human emotion and expressiveness. But Puritanism is much more important than that when we understand its origins. Its origins are not religious, certainly not biblical. After all, the songs in the Bible are called specifically that, songs, solitaire. They're rhythmic. And that's why you see our Jewish brothers and sisters, when they recite their prayers, which are generally the psalm, they're always moving. Because originally they were all danced. They were danced. In any primitive society, dance, poetry, and music and rhythm are all united in one thing. As in a Greek chorus, they were still united in a formal way. But our society has lost most of it. Now I know how it got to this point, but well, what was the question that brought all this up? Oh, you asked something about theatricality.
Yeah, the theatricality.
And I was saying that we are not easy with it because our Puritan attitudes, superficially, for the common person, for the average person. I don't mean common in any derogatory way. It tells me it's not all right to laugh out in public, You can't whistle in the house. Stuff like that.
Okay, so
I came to the problems presented by Puritanism in the attempt to get people to, quote, participate actively in worship. And one of the ways in which the congregation participates actively, since they can't get up and move around, at least not all of them, is to, by the expressiveness of by their vocal expressions. And when I started out, I have to threaten, cajole, entreat, plead, beg, whip, do anything to get them to do something other than praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. It's not expressive of faith, it's not expressive of anything except a mindlessness. And in confronting that problem, I had to look at it. What's causing this? Why are people like this? Especially in church. You get them into the bathtub, in the bathroom, you can't shut them up. You get them out on the dance floor, you can't stop them. no matter how awkward they are. You can't stop them, especially if they've had a few drinks that lower their inhibitions. And I blamed it all on, like most people do, on Puritanism or European culture. It has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with certain social principles that have been imposed on society by a culture, mostly academic, that has been dominated by the sense of sight. Seeing is believing, and any amateur magician can tell you that the hand is quicker than the eye. You know. And if sight dominates and suppresses all the other senses, you'll have touch at the bottom. Because touch is the most antithetical to sight. Why? Physiologically. Stick your finger in your eye. It hurts. And the eye values the continuous line. The human eye does not see in 3 dimensions. It cannot distinguish between spaces between things. It sees all things as a flat continuing surface. Only by sense of touch do we know that there are spaces. And so when touch is suppressed, we get this 2-dimensional view of things. And everything is, that's the way that music was that evening at the Athenaeum. 2-dimensional. No expressiveness, no rhythm, because rhythm is not a continuation of a line, but the break, a pattern of breaks in a musical line. That's how come y'all don't have no rhythm. Has nothing to do with your background. It has to do with your sense that, or some people sense, the academics sense that what is proper is very even and unbroken line, very smooth. And that's very nice for 5 minutes, but it's not, it doesn't stir you up. It doesn't get the juices going. You wouldn't do that before going out to battle. or any other such thing. You'd want something much more, quote, primitive.
So we give greater homage to the academic, the intellectual over the emotional.
It's not the intellectual. It's the ocular. Remember that. It's the dominance of the sense of sight over the other senses. It is not the dominance of the intellect over the person. I mean, the person culminates, so to speak, in the intellect. And what the person is a very, in the Puritan sense, wild thing that has to be controlled. Because the eye doesn't want all that. The eye doesn't want involvement. The eye wants to stand back and observe objectively. So we don't want to touch other people at the sign of peace. We have this aversion to doing that. And we think that music that somehow doesn't move you is more ethereal and heavenly.
But you're right, that's only a church.
That's only a church. Because we don't feel that we got to be proper any other place. You don't have to be proper on the dance floor. You don't have to be proper when you turn your radio on in your car. And yet, we do have this sense in our society that music which is played incompetently is better than music which is played with some competence and style. The Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra had what they called, because they weren't getting many blacks in attendance, that they were sitting in the middle of what used to be the black community, and yet no blacks, very few blacks entered the doors. So they had what they call the open door series, where they brought in sometimes black artists like, was it Errol Garner? Is he a black pianist? I happened to be there that evening because Eric Kunkel was going to direct some music for me. And he wanted me to see how he did. And this open door series would bring in a popular artist, frequently black, who would do his thing, and sometimes with the orchestra, and then that would be the first part of the program, and then the second part of the program would be the orchestra by itself. And sitting next to me in Eric Kunzel's box was the lady who was president of the Women's Symphony Society, or whatever the hell it was. And she said, as Errol Garner was playing, we're giving them this, but once they get used to coming in, then we're going to give them a whole evening of serious music. Now that's the death of music, to call it serious. Like a serious illness. I mean, music is for entertainment. It's not for being serious about, in that sense of the word. You know, certainly it's nothing more serious than play. We speak of playing the piano, playing the organ, playing the instruments. We speak of the most certain kinds of games as, quote, word play. Play is an important concept. But we lose sight of it under the influence of the dominance, the ocular, versus what we call the oral. A tradition that's handed on orally doesn't have this problem. Our traditions are handed on visually in books, and not even visually in the sense of moving things, static print. The Endowment for the Humanities had out a book about what it supported. And it started off with the statement that most of human culture is preserved in books and works of art. It's a stupid statement, and it's a lie. Most of human culture is preserved in human beings. And the books, apart from those human beings, don't make any sense at all. You have to know the books in their human context to know what the books were meant to convey. You understand what I mean? A couple of years ago, we had this great phenomenon of badly sung Gregorian chant out of the Spanish monastery taking over the world. Well, it was a PR, product. That is, the wide display of the record was not because the music itself excited. The music was interesting because it was unusual, because most people, with their bent toward popular music, found this an interesting curiosity. and thought of it therefore as otherworldly and holy, and they'd like a part of that. And that sold the record. But you and I, who have been in the seminary and sung Gregorian chant for 10 straight years, know that you better put some life into it or you can go to sleep very quickly. It doesn't take you otherworldly, it puts you to sleep.